My name's Christopher Macdonald. I'm from Anime News Network, and I have with me Dr. Suzanne Napier. Dr. Napier is something of an expert when it comes to anime, so we're actually going to talk a tiny bit about Rose of Versailles, and after a couple minutes we'll open it up to audience questions, and I believe we have some questions from the internet too, right? Awesome. So, Dr. Napier or Suzanne?
Susan, actually. Yeah.
Susan, sorry.
But you can
Okay, so now Rose of Versailles came out, the manga, around 1970, and the anime a short while after, and it was exceptionally popular in Japan, and there's some very interesting reasons for that. So I was wondering if you could just tell us a bit about why it's so popular, who it's popular with.
Sure. Actually, I think it came out in '72. Just slight correction there. The reason why I mentioned this is I actually ran into it when I was in Japan my first time ever in 1973, and the little sister of the Japanese family I was staying with was reading it. And I have to admit, as a Westerner at that time, remember nobody knew anything about manga in the States. It was somewhat surprising to me because I first couldn't figure out what it was about. I could barely read Japanese at that point, and I was looking at it and thinking, Versailles. Sounds like Versailles, but why? Here is this beautiful comic book with lovely women with long hair, and it seems to be set in France. What's going on? But of course, I think that was part of its appeal. It was a beautiful, beautiful manga. As some of you know, probably this was written by and drawn by Ryoko Ikeda, who was a member of the so-called Year 24 group, who were a group of women artists who were very talented and in their own way very revolutionary. They came out during this early 70s period. They sort of gone through the late 60s time of real kind of student rebellions and a real radical period in Japan. And they started producing these manga. They were among the first women writers, really important. And I think that also may have been part of it, that if you're a young girl, you're finally reading manga that are directed for young girls, written by a woman. And of course, with Rose of Versailles, you also have this extraordinary exotic setting, which is so spectacular. I mean, just the beauty of Versailles, the costumes, the hair, it was just incredibly appealing. And then you have the story of Marie Antoinette. It's not like everyone's familiar with Marie Antoinette in 1972 Japan, but as you know, it becomes a tragic and very kind of draws it in as a story. But of course, the masterstroke was Oscar, Lady Oscar, who was a fictitious character, of course, dreamed up by Ryoko Ikeda. And originally, she wasn't going to be the major character in the story. That the story was supposed to belong to Marie Antoinette. But and this is another kind of interesting aspect about the series. That a lot of fan reaction was important in it. And so Ikeda and a lot of these the Year 24 people were beginning to be much more aware of fan response. And so Oscar, after being introduced, quickly became hugely, hugely popular, and the fans were really into her. And she's such a fascinating character, and I really think that this combination of, and I'd love to talk more about Oscar, but just to give you a general answer, it's this fascinating, haunting, powerful female character who is really quite unusual for the period, and again for Japan to have this strong, powerful woman characters in Japanese society. That period is also very unusual. Plus this exotic, beautiful, exceptionally romantic setting, and the gorgeous artwork that was really, really kind of unique and special.
So when we're talking about Oscar and how revolutionary she was, the manga itself, aside from finally appealing to girls, the girls' demographic, being like one of the forerunners of the shoujo genre, there's also a few other revolutions that kind of take place in Rose of Versailles. It featured, interestingly, some of the earliest elements of theory. It featured, I believe, the first bed scene in a manga ever.
Yeah, hugely influential. Yeah.
Yeah. How's that influenced Japanese culture, Japanese girls at the time, and the future of the genre.
Wow. I mean, I probably can't over-exaggerate how influential it was. It's really interesting about Oscar because she is a character who can appeal on very many different levels, many different approaches. On the one hand is, and I do want to recommend, if you're interested in Rose of Versailles, a book by Deborah Shamoun, who talks about, she's a professor, she writes a lot about girls manga, and she points out that you have, in a way, both a kind of quasi-lesbian aspect to the series, but also in the long run, Oscar, and I don't think I'm giving too much away, does also have strong relationships with adult male characters. So in a way, it's something for everybody. And in Japan, you've always had at least since the late 19th, early 20th century, there's something called the S relationships, which are between schoolgirls in Japan, and these would be typically a younger girl and an older, as one of her seniors in secondary school, and they would be very strong relationships. And they might be sexual or they might not be, but they are actually, there are indications in pre-war manga of these stories as well. So this was not totally revolutionary, not that it had never been done, but that it had been done so widely, and that Oscar herself is such is seen as both a male and female character, which was really liberating and truly revolutionary. There had been something by Tezuka Osamu, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with, as the great god of manga, one of the first great manga artists starting in the late 40s and 50s. He made a series called Moon no Kishi, which is translated in English as Princess Knight. And that is a kind of gender-bending series in that the heroine goes back and forth between a male and being a female through magic. But that's just more of an adventure series. We don't really get inside her head. She's not that complex a character. Oscar, and we only see a little bit of her right now. At the beginning, the first episode is very comedic, it's fun, but as she grows throughout the series, she becomes this very complex, very fascinating person. And I think that was also part of it, to have a character who was interestingly androgynous, or perhaps even has a lesbian aspect to her personality. At the same time, was a really three-dimensional, and frankly, I'm talking about not giving away too much, tragic figure, was just revolutionary in so many different ways.
I'd love to talk about that more, but let's move on. Just we're very limited on time, to a bit about the people who enjoy Rose of Versailles. I mean, we talked about how important it is to girls. It was one of the key series manga ever in the shoujo genre. But you were telling me before the panel that you recently met a middle-aged Japanese gentleman who's a big fan.
Yeah, I was at a dinner party on Friday night. I mentioned that I was. Last Friday I mentioned I was coming down to talk about Rose of Versailles to my table mate, who was probably in his early 40s, from Japan. He said, "Oh, Rose of Versailles, I love that. I had to steal it from my sister." And, so yeah, it was so popular among, just across the board, and I think. Again, you have it has a lot of elements that appeal to men. I'm sorry, I'm being kind of a little bit gender stereotyping here, but you can see that you already have a fight in the first episode. You have a lot of swordplay. I really recommend staying with this, because you have the vision of the fall of Paris, the fall of the Bastille. It's a great revolutionary epic. And apparently, we were just talking about this before, that people were so entranced by this vision of France and so fascinated by it that they would go to France, these Japanese fans of Versailles, and would hope to find in the France of the 20th century the Rose of Versailles. And you said it was, what's the term that you used?
Well, what happens is that French girls grew up reading Rose of Versailles, dreaming about finally going to Paris. It's very hard for them to save up money and get vacation time. So when they finally get to go on their first vacation, they've been working for a couple of years, they've been dreaming about this since they were a teenager. They go to France, and they go to Paris specifically, which is not the friendliest place in the world. I can say that, I'm actually a French citizen. Yeah, we don't treat you guys very well. and they get depressed, and they go home depressed. They're like, this has been their dream for their entire life, and they've actually got a name for it. It's called Paris syndrome. But the other interesting, yeah, it's not just Japan, but it's really well known in Japan. But the other thing that's interesting, and we were talking about that before also, is that in North America, we often hear about how manga and anime are being used to popularize Japanese culture. But here we have the manga that in Japan rather, created a huge interest in French culture, and all those people that did go to France.
Yeah, I always have to explain to people who don't know much about Japan that actually the Japanese are very literate in Western civilization. I mean, they know their Beethoven probably better than a lot of us Americans do. Yeah, right, exactly. Beethoven, Chopin, and they know English and French literature too. But the fact is that Rose of Versailles, again, was a manga version of French history. And it's huge. I mean, it's must be about 1,000 pages, and it's very gripping, and you can read it very quickly. But at the same time, it's absolutely all-encompassing, in that you really are drawn into this richly imagined society, and there's so many interesting characters in it. And it also was an incredibly exciting time in French history. So in a way, it's both a manga, an anime, but it's also this great historical novel. And you can see why people would love it. Just on the Paris syndrome, I can't help thinking about what happened with Avatar. There were people apparently who were very upset that Pandora didn't exist, and they got a kind of depression too. So it may not just be French syndrome or even manga, but there's something about a really popular cultural spectacle that can just absolutely overwhelm people to the point where they want to live in that alternate world if they possibly could.
Now, we were saying before, you said it came out in 1972, and this is 40 years old. Why do you think there's still an interest in Rose of Versailles today, 40 years later, where most titles from that era have been kind of regarded?
I think that's a really important question. I think it is because, this goes back to your point about the revolutionary aspect of Rose of Versailles. It was so influential. I mean, it inspired, partly as part of this whole revolution in shoujo girls manga, the kind of style it used, the serious adult themes. You mentioned again the bed scenes. I mean, now we sort of take it for granted if you're looking at manga to have a fair amount of erotic scenes, but this was again a first, and it was considered a classic, pretty early on, I think. And its classics tend to remain classics. They're still appreciated. I think they were even used, Rose of Versailles, in some schools as a text to learn about the French Revolution. So it was something that people knew about and would pass on. Again, at this dinner party on Friday, people were saying that, yeah, they loved it, and they would pass it down to their children. In fact, I was talking to someone who said that she had kept it all those years to give to her daughter because it was such a great story. So again, as any classic is, it's a great story with incredibly compelling characters, and it influenced so many recent manga and anime. I mean, I think Sailor Moon. There's a very strong female characters who we kind of take for granted now in anime and manga, but at that point they were very, very rare and few on the ground. And this was remarkable. I mean, any society, not just Japan, but in 1972 to have a really smart, interesting, rebellious, powerful woman character. I mean, it was huge, and I think that for a lot of people that she became a kind of icon of a different kind of femininity. And so, of course, you have Sailor Moon. I remember hearing about Sailor Moon that the person who developed it was told, there's no way, why would you want to create a series about girl superheroes? And of course it became one of the most best-selling series in manga history. And then of course you also have Revolutionary Girl Utena. I mean, it's so obvious if you look at Utena how much she has. She's a great character too, another strong, powerful, idiosyncratic female who wants to protect other people, and has both sort of female and male qualities, and very, very powerful and influential. If you like Utena, you might want to go back and look at Rose of Versailles. I think it's the obvious inspiration for Utena.
Me too. I was actually just about about to ask you about, Lieutenant.
Yeah, well, it's a wonderful series, and again, I recommend it to those of you who haven't seen it. It takes some of the themes of that are kind of implicit in Rose of Versailles, such as homoeroticism, also kind of some of the more there are sort of decadent aspects that come up in the series, some of them which are historically accurate, by the way. I mean, Marie Antoinette was accused of lesbianism and all kinds of decadent orgies and things like that, that at her trial before she was executed. And again, this is shown in the manga and the anime, which again for 1972 would be quite remarkable. And Lieutenant is more kind of cutting edge, shall we say, in these relationships, and there's a more obvious homoerotic theme there. But again, I think it goes back to that it wouldn't have happened without Rose of Versailles kind of blazing the trail.